Hello, everyone. It's time for another stream, and I found something worth responding to on Cameron's channel. Well, I mean, I don't just look at Cameron's channel, but a lot of the other ones have even less interesting stuff than Cameron somehow. But anyway, as usual, Cameron's been focusing on the really heavy-hitting intellectual topics like demons and culture war stuff and Olympic athletes and whatever other nonsense. But I did find a short from him, in which he asks a few questions. Well, some more questions for atheists. He's done this before. I think I've responded to him in the past. Now I know he just does these for clicks and attention. He doesn't seem super interested in actually having a sincere dialogue about this. For example, he doesn't invite atheists to discuss these sorts of things on his channel or come on other channels, or respond at length to any of the comments, for example. So these would all be signs of genuine interest and engagement. But anyway, nevertheless, I think there are some interesting questions here. And I thought I could also use this opportunity to do some sort of self-promotion of my own, kind of play off Cameron's promoting his channel via asking these questions to promote my book, in which, as we'll see, I provide some answers to his questions. So this video is originally a short, but because shorts are basically Satan spawn, I've opened it as a regular video, though it's still portrait mode, so I do apologize for that. So I think I'll just play it all through, and then we might go back and focus on a couple of bits, and then I'll provide some of my answers.
All right, I've got three more questions for atheists. Here is number one. Do you believe that our beliefs ought to be proportioned to the evidence? So should we only really believe something if we've got evidence in favor of it? Number two is, if we could verify that some miracle actually occurred, would that give us a reason to think that God exists? And again, this is contingent on whether or not we could actually verify that the miracle happened. All right, number three, and this is my final question. If you're an atheist that cares about truth and thinks that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, but then you also think that we've got this unique way to verify whether or not God exists through studying miracles, how many of the millions of miracle reports throughout history have you actually deeply investigated?
All right, so let's jump this back a little bit.
Number one, do you believe that our beliefs...
And give a response here.
All right, I've got three more questions for atheists. Here is number one. Do you believe that our beliefs ought to be proportioned to the evidence? So should we only really believe something if we've got evidence in favor of it?
So this is obviously just a setup for the questions that he's going to ask next, which, that's fine. I don't really have an issue with that. The wording here is very deliberate. David Hume famously said, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. So I think he's trying to evoke that to try to encourage the atheists to feel like they have to say yes to this question. I don't necessarily think that an atheist or a naturalist is obliged to answer yes to this question. So the philosophical issue here is called evidentialism. Evidentialism is the view that the only thing that can justify a belief is evidence for that belief. So, for example, pragmatic considerations about what it's useful to believe, for instance, or what makes you happy, would be considered irrelevant. Now, personally, I do lean towards evidentialism. I do think there's a more complex discussion to be had here, because there's different, in my opinion, there are different normative standards there, and epistemic standards are one normative standard. So if you're asking me, what is it that can epistemically justify a belief, I would say, well, it's evidence. Like, and by evidence here, we mean sort of the totality of the, it's hard to define this in a non-circular way, I guess. The totality of your reasons that count in favor of thinking that that is true or approximates reality, or, something like that. So pragmatic considerations, for example, wouldn't count as epistemic reasons to believe something. But you might ask the question slightly differently and say, could I have non-epistemic reasons for believing in something? Outside of the question of justification. Like, yeah, I might not be epistemically justified in believing it, but maybe there's sort of other reasons for believing in it. And I'm kind of open to that. Though, for the purposes here, I'm happy to just agree and say, yeah, sure, let's go with evidentialism. Let's just say we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, and that that's sort of the end of the question. So I'm happy to go with that here, while acknowledging that there are some additional complexities here.
Number two is, if we could verify that some miracle actually occurred, would that give us a reason to think that God exists? And again, this is
So I think this is a poorly worded question. Maybe it's deliberately poorly worded. I don't know. The problem here is the word miracle, because let me get this exactly right.
Would that give us a reason?
If we could
verify that some miracle actually occurred.
Yeah, so if we could verify that a miracle occurred. So the problem there is, what is the definition of a miracle? Because if a miracle is defined as being an act of God or an act of a supernatural being, then obviously demonstrating that a miracle occurred would disprove naturalism. And so that kind of means that it's going to be very difficult to establish that a miracle occurred, right? Because you'd have to demonstrate something about what caused it. So the problem about defining a miracle in that way, by the way, I'm not saying that Cameron's defined it, miracles in that way. He hasn't defined them at all, right? But I'm just saying, suppose you define them that way, you're actually defining a miracle in terms of its causes, right? You're saying something counts as a miracle only if it's caused in a certain way, namely by a supernatural entity or a god or something like that. So the point there is, you can't just look at the phenomenon and say, is it a miracle or not? You actually need to know what caused it. So even something like a resurrection, you couldn't actually tell. Suppose you established that someone had been raised from the dead, right? That they were dead for a week by any definition of dead, and then they came back and they were alive again, right? Suppose you established that happened. You still couldn't know if that was a miracle or not. Why? Because you would have to know if it was caused by supernatural means. And you might ask, well, how else could it be caused? Well, it could be caused by advanced technology that we don't understand, right? That was entirely natural. At least hypothetically. I'm not saying how plausible that would be. I'm just saying, at least hypothetically, that's an option on the table. And therefore, simply establishing the phenomenon wouldn't establish that it is a miracle. You see what I'm saying? Because if you define a miracle as something caused by supernatural means, you have to know that it was caused by supernatural means. You can't just establish that something fantastical or out of the ordinary happened. Now, so that's a problem with defining miracles in that way. Now, you may say, okay, let's not define them that way. Let's just define them as something that exceeds our understanding of what can happen in nature without intervention by an intelligence or something like that. I don't know exactly how you define it, right? So you try to define it without specifying the cause. The problem with that is that with that definition of miracles, atheists and naturalists can readily believe in miracles, because they can just say, yeah, there's things that could happen that are outside of our understanding of how nature can do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it is actually, I should make myself big here, shouldn't I? That doesn't mean that it's necessarily caused by something outside of nature. It just means that it's outside of what we currently understand nature is able to do. So defining miracles in that way means that as an atheist or a naturalist, you can actually believe that there are miracles. Now, I think that the problem with that language is that I think that's not what most people mean by miracle, at least most of the time, in this sort of discussion at least. They don't necessarily mean just something inexplicable. They mean something that transcends nature, or something supernormal, supernatural, transcendent, something like that, right? So that's closer to the first definition that we talked about. So given that background, again, let me just make sure I don't misquote him here.
Number two is, if we could verify that some miracle actually occurred, would that give us a reason to think that God exists?
Yeah, would that give us a reason to think that God exists? So the answer depends on how you define miracle. Under the definition of a miracle being something supernaturally caused, I think that probably would, if we could establish a miracle, that probably would give us a reason to believe in God, but largely because it's sort of built into the definition. A miracle needn't necessarily be caused by an omnipotent God. It could be caused by a God who was limited in some way, like the Greek or Roman pantheon or something like that. So I don't know that it necessarily points to the God that Cameron believes in, but it may point to some type of supernatural entity. But at that point, it's largely a definitional thing. If we can establish that an event caused by a supernatural being happened, would that give us a reason to think that a supernatural being exists? Well, of course, because you can't have an event caused by something if that thing doesn't exist, right? So that's kind of redundant as a question. And the thing is, you're not going to actually be able to use the occurrence of the event as evidence for the supernatural being in that case. Why? Because in order to establish that it's a miracle, you have to know that it was caused by a supernatural being, and the atheist is likely to not agree that it was caused by a supernatural being. They'll say it was caused by something else, in which case you won't agree that it is a miracle. Because the strategy here seems to be establish the miracle occurred, infer the existence of God from that miracle. But if to get to the first step, you already have to have gotten to the second step, well, then it's a pointless strategy, right? It can never work. And in fact, I think most apologetics arguments like this, that in order to get to the premise, in order for the premises to be sufficiently plausible, you already kind of have to believe in the conclusion. But anyway, that's obviously a broader point. But I think that's kind of an issue here with the first definition of a miracle. So I guess I'm presenting a bit of a dilemma here. Do we define a miracle as something caused by a supernatural being? If we say yes, then I would agree with Cameron here and say, yes, we should take a miracle as evidence for God, or at least some type of God. But the problem is that kind of becomes trivial because we can never establish a miracle without having got to the stage of believing in God in the first place, because we need to establish what caused the event. On the other hand, the second horn, if we define a miracle, if we don't define a miracle that way, we just say it's something that we don't understand or outside of the normal powers that we understand nature to have, then we can establish a miracle without knowing what caused it. But in that case, I would say it's entirely unclear what the problem is here for skeptics or for naturalists or atheists, because they can just believe, because in that sense, they can believe in miracles. A miracle under this sense is just something we don't understand or something sufficiently unusual, right? Something sufficiently outside the bounds of our understanding. But in this definition, something like dark energy or dark matter could be a miracle because it's very outside of what we understood before we discovered it, right? And it's like, we don't really know what this is. But, we don't normally call those things miracles. We just call them unsolved problems, right? So I think I don't actually know which side of the horn I would go for myself, because I don't know what the best way to define a miracle is. I tend to think that the concept is not well defined, and that's one of the reasons I don't like appeals to miracles, because the language and the concepts are too fuzzy here. I would prefer that we are more precise and just talk about a phenomenon and ask what are the best explanations for this phenomenon. So, for example, we have documents of people reporting to have seen Jesus after he was killed, right? What's the best explanation for those documents and testimonies and so forth? And likewise for other miracle claims. So just take the observable phenomena and ask what the best explanation for that is. That's, I think, the best approach. So you can talk about miracle claims or abnormal events or unusual occurrences, things like that, but without needing to specify exactly how we define a miracle. So that's my preferred approach here. But once again, just for the sake of argument, I'm kind of willing to say, look, if there's an event that we cannot explain through natural means, at least that should open us, we should be open to the possibility that there is a better supernatural explanation that invokes God, for example. I think we should be open to that possibility. I think it's very unlikely that we'll ever accept that for, reasons I've talked about for a long time, but we should be open to that. The possibility, and we shouldn't just always reject it out of hand or refuse to consider the arguments, right? So if that's all Cameron's trying to get at here, then I'm happy to agree. Yep, there's a possibility that if there are unexplained events, maybe they could be caused by supernatural agency, and we should remain open to that and, consider the arguments that are given in favor of it. So if that's what Cameron's looking for here, then yeah, I'm happy to say yes. So far, what Cameron's doing is building up to the third question, which is, I think, really what he wants to ask here.
And again, this is contingent on whether or not we could actually verify that the miracle happened. All right, number 3, and this is my final question. If you're an atheist that cares about truth and thinks that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, but then you also think that we've got this unique way to verify whether or not God exists through studying miracles, how many of the millions of miracle reports throughout history have you actually deeply investigated?
Note that there's a bit of a slippage in the argument here, because he slips from talking about the second question was actually about miracles, but then he talks about miracle reports or miracle claims. And those are actually very different things. So as an atheist, you could think, yes, if there were miracles, or hypothetically, if there was a miracle, that could be evidence for God. But that doesn't mean that you think that miracle claims can be evidence for God. Now, that might sound like a distinction without a difference. But what I mean is here, you might think like Hume that miracle claims can never have sufficient evidentiary standing in order to overcome their low pride plausibility, for example. So, and I mean, that's just one example of a reason you might not think miracle claims. You may think that studying miracle claims is not a useful thing to do. It's not a way to gain knowledge about the divine or potential existence of the divine. So I think that slippage between miracle claims the slippage between miracles in the abstract, just like if there was a miracle, versus miracle claims as they actually exist, that's actually a big difference there. You could agree in principle that if a miracle was established, that would be evidence for God, but disagree that any actual miracle claim is even worth looking at, for example. Now, I'm not saying that you should make that leap. I'm just saying that that's an option on the table for the atheist, which Cameron's ignored here. And I think he's ignored that because he hasn't been careful about the development of he's not literally making an argument there, but he's coming pretty close to it at the end there when he sets out the first two, which are like his premises. The first one is like evidentialism and caring about truth. And the second one is thinking that miracles are a potential way of finding out about God. And so the conclusion is something like, well, if you agree with those two things, then you should investigate miracle claims. I think that's what he's saying. And he's obviously trying to use this as a kind of a gotcha, because he's trying to say, look, atheists care about truth and evidence, and they think that in principle, miracles could be evidence for the divine. Therefore, they should investigate miracle claims, but they don't investigate miracle claims. Therefore, they're hypocrites or something like that, right? It's unclear whether this argument is really even successful, even if you accept all the premises. And I'm kind of saying, well, one reason it's not is because you might think that miracle claims could, in principle, be evidence for the divine, but in practice, the actual claims that we have are so far from could never reach the standing that we would need them to, for example, because of the limits of testimony, for instance, or because of the, Hume's argument about the fact that by definition, a miracle is something contrary to the vast majority of our experience, and we're never going to have any empirical evidence or like testimony that outweighs the majority of our experience. So kind of by definition, they're going to always have insufficient evidence. There's different arguments you could make. So that's an option on the table to get out of this bind. And there's other options on the table as well. Oh, hey, Nathan. And hey, everyone else as well, by the way, Ancient Flames. So there's a lot of options on the table here for the atheist, but I don't want to take any of those options because I actually just want to bite the bullet and say, yeah, we should look at miracle claims, because I actually do think we should, and not even just for like counter-apologetic purposes, because I think they're an interesting part of human existence, anthropology, history, and sociology, and so forth. And I think that it's a good exercise to have a look at them and try to understand them. And I'm just curious because I want to know, okay, people report all sorts of bizarre things happening. Why do they do that? Like, what's going on here? What can we learn about the world and humanity and so forth by investigating and trying to explain these claims? So I'm just going to agree with everything that Cameron is sort of getting at here and say, yes, we should investigate miracle claims as atheists, and we should take them seriously. And then to answer his final question, how many of the millions of miracle claims that have been made have you investigated in depth? Well, I don't have a precise number, but my best guess is on the order of, it's probably at least 500 like distinct claims that I've actually investigated. Now, I say that because in my book, and longtime listeners knew this was coming, in my book, I discuss, I think, about 65 in some detail. Well, actually, not even, it's 65 different people or types of claims. So that's not individual claims. Within each of those, there's many different specific claims. There's also many that I investigated that didn't make it into the book. Many I've investigated since then, including well, I don't know if it depends if you count things like parapsychology and things like that, near-death experiences, miraculous healing claims. So it's definitely hundreds. And to be honest, if you're thinking over my entire life, I think 500 is actually a reasonable estimate. But maybe it's only 200 or 300. So I can't know the precise number. Of course, you could say, well, there are millions, and so you've only scratched the surface. But I mean, that's sort of the problem, right? Like, no one can ever investigate all of the millions of claims, or even a large proportion. However, I think what you can do is take some of the best documented examples and take a kind of a sampling of different types of claims from different places in history, times and places in history, and also different types of phenomena, and investigate them and see what common patterns there are. And to some extent, I have done that. I don't claim to be an expert on this. I'm more of like an enthusiastic amateur. But what we're going to do I don't have a whole lot of time this evening, but in whatever time we have, is have a look at some of the miracle claims that I've actually looked into. And just mention them very briefly, just to sort of whet your appetite. And if you're interested, of course, you can check out my book where I discuss this in detail. I do think that this is coming from chapter, oh bugger, what is it? So this book is actually about responding to William Lane Craig's argument for Christianity. One of his main arguments is the argument from the resurrection of Jesus. And as an investigation of that, as a sort of parallel comparison, I look at other miracle claims. And the claim that I make is that there are many other miracle claims that are comparably well evidenced to the resurrection, and in some cases much better evidenced. And we shouldn't accept those as genuine because we have better explanations, and the same is the case for the resurrection itself. So I discuss this in chapter 5 of my book on the Christological argument. And specifically, it's under postulate 3 where I talk about this, collective religious experiences. So I go through and outline some of the findings of my research into this, looking at different miracle claims from different religious traditions. Again, there's also other things that I include as well, like parapsychology claims of seeing ghosts and things like that, which is sort of unclear whether they count as miracles because they're not explicitly religious they don't occur in an explicitly religious setting, but I think they meet the definition of a paranormal or supernatural or beyond the phenomena that's beyond the capacity of nature to produce. So anyway, here we go. Oh, and also I only included in this book public miracle claims, meaning that there were multiple witnesses, or at least it was claimed that there were multiple witnesses to the event. So nothing that is a miracle that only a single individual observed. So, for example, the angel, it was Gabriel, right, who appeared to Muhammad and dictated the Quran. That wouldn't count because that was a private, experience for him. For example, Joseph Smith's first vision would be another example. There are other Mormon miracles in here that have multiple people, but the point is that I had to go through a lot of miracle claims to just find the ones where there were multiple witnesses or claims that there were multiple witnesses there. So there's many more that I looked through that didn't fit those. So let's start with some Catholic miracles. So given his recent changes in conviction, I suspect that Cameron might be willing to say that these are genuine miracles. Many Protestants are not, so it's sort of interesting to raise these. So Our Lady of Fatima, that's actually one of the largest miracle claims in terms of number of people. There were 70,000 people at Fatima in Portugal in 1917 who saw what's called the miracle of the sun. So that's one you can look up. Oh, I don't have time to go into the details here. I'm just sort of going to mention them and whet your appetite if you're interested in looking into them. Our Lady of Assuit. So that's more appearances of the Virgin Mary in Egypt in 2000. This one's interesting because Muslims and Christians both experienced some sort of phenomena there. They both reported this. So we have sort of religious skeptics, if you like. Our Lady of Zaytun, that's more marine apparitions in Cairo in the 60s. More Muslims and other non-Christians observing this. Our Lady of, Medjugorje. I don't know how to pronounce that name. This is in the former Yugoslavia. That is how you spell it. So this is a really weird case of a group of 6 people, bearing in mind that this is occurring in a communist country in the 80s. So, I mean, there's still religious people there, but it's not exactly a context where that sort of thing is encouraged. And they had a number of experiences that they reported and have multiple witnesses for that have been investigated in quite a lot of detail, but they're sort of a bit complicated there, what happened. Let's see. Oh, another interesting one, the Convulsionaries of Saint Medard. So that was a case from 18th century France where hundreds of people reported seeing healings, convulsions, and other strange events after visiting the grave of a recently deceased heretical deacon called Francois de Paris. So most of the source material there is in French, which is another limiting factor I encountered when actually trying to investigate a lot of these miracle claims, is because many of them occur in non-English speaking contexts. And so it's hard to get good documentary evidence because a lot of this stuff hasn't been translated. Okay, so let's move to new Christian movements. So Simon Kimbangu. So this is a 20th century African religious leader. There's some interesting information on him on the internet. He claimed to be a special envoy of Christ. Many miracles attributed to him, including healings and raising the dead. There's some documents about here from the I think it was the Belgian colonial authorities at the time. But again, much of the literature is in French, so it's a bit hard to find information there. Oral Roberts, so that's a renowned 20th century faith healer and televangelist. He also claims to have raised the dead. He wrote a book about that where he outlined some of his claims. You can also find more information about that on his website. There's the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon. So the three companions to Joseph Smith who declared and actually have their signed declarations that they saw an angel appear to them and show them the gold plates. All of these people subsequently left the Mormon church and had disagreements with Joseph Smith, but none of them retracted their testimonies of this particular incident. So that one's actually interesting because we actually have a first-person account signed by all of these men here, declaring what they saw, like on what specific date, which is far more than we have for the Gospels. Okay, Jewish miracle claims. So Theudas, I don't freaking know. Need Camille on here. I don't know how to pronounce that name. Theudas. So this is a first century Jewish rebel. There were actually quite a few other either Messiah claimants or other kind of Jewish rebel figures who are recorded around the first century and have miracles attributed to them. We don't have a lot of information about most of them because most of their movements died out. But Josephus describes him as having convinced many people that he performed miracles. So I've got an excerpt from Josephus there. Eleazar ben Hyrcanus, a rabbi of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD who performed miracles in support of a particular doctrinal claim that he was advocating. So there's some passages in the Mishnah that talk about this, and I've got a passage in here. So he's actually trying to perform miracles or does perform miracles to defend a specific doctrinal point that he's making, which is interesting because Christian apologists often talk about the idea that, oh, well, people will die for a lie, but they won't die for something that they are in a position to have known themselves, and for a belief that a miracle that supports a specific religious belief. They talk about the religious context that the alleged resurrection and appearances of Jesus occurred in, and that's important. Well, we have examples of that as well. We have Shabbatai Zevai, who was a 17th century Turkish rabbi. This is a super interesting. I strongly recommend looking this one up. Shabbatai Zevai. Very interesting case. So this is a 17th century Turkish rabbi and Messiah claimant who is said to perform many miracles, including predicting the future. He attracted many followers throughout the Jewish world, very big movement back then. But then he was captured by the Ottomans and was forced to convert to Islam. And even after he did that, he still retained some of his followers. Many people became disillusioned, but some stayed. I think some of them said that it was a fake conversion and that he was doing it for some greater reason. I can't remember what their justification was. It's very interesting. He still has some followers to this day, centuries later. And you can find modern biographies that relate some of his claimed miracles as well. Another one, Baal Shem Tov, an 18th century Polish mystical rabbi credited with many miracles. And there's a particular book there that I reference where that's discussed. One of the most interesting cases, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, a 20th century Jewish rabbi attributed to whom many healings are attributed. Again, I'm just trying to show the spelling there if you want to Google them yourself. Now, this is a very interesting case because he died. He died in the 90s or something, a couple of decades ago. But there have been many reports of his followers seeing him after he died. And some of the followers that he retains believe that he has been raised from the dead and have seen him in many contexts. So they believe some of his followers believe that he was the Messiah. So that's obviously has interesting parallels to the Jesus case. Let's see. So we have a bunch from ancient Rome who were like outside the Jewish context. So interestingly, a number of the Roman emperors have miracles attributed to them. I think I just mentioned one here, Emperor Vespasian, written by Suetonius, who talks about an interesting anecdote. The Roman emperors were thought to have healing powers. And so there are reports that we have of them touching or interacting with people in some way that led to them being healed. So this is just one, but I do believe there are other examples of this. Apollonius of Tyana, so this was a 1st century AD Greek philosopher and popular orator credited with many miracles. We know about him through his biographer Philostratus, who wrote only a century or so after his life, so a bit longer than the Gospels were, but not dramatically so. We know about him because the satirical writer Lucian wrote a pamphlet where he attacked Alexandra. Um, uh, he attacked one of the students of Apollonius as a charlatan. And so we can tell from that, at least, that Apollonius really did have students and that people really did follow him, even if his movement didn't ultimately survive. This is one of the points that Christian apologists kind of don't want you to know, by the way, is that they say sort of things like, oh, well, no one would have continued to follow Jesus if he hadn't had good evidence or people hadn't been in a position to talk to eyewitnesses and things like that. And we know this because, other movements from the time didn't survive and things like that, and they didn't have the robustness that Christianity had. And like, this is just nonsense, right? Like, obviously it's true that many movements from the time didn't survive, but there's no reason to think that this was because of any evidential quality of the movement. I think it's largely because of Constantine, actually, although Christianity did have a few other things going for it. But the point is, there were many, many other movements, Jewish and non-Jewish, in the Roman Empire that had charismatic leaders and miracle claims and active followers, and many of them were still very popular, essentially until Christianity gained dominance and stamped them all out over time. Simon Magus is another example. He's actually mentioned in the Gospels, but we have other references to him. We have many Indian miracle workers, and I've probably only scratched the surface of these because a lot of material is not available in English. So Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, a Muslim religious leader from the 19th century, founder of the Ahmadiyya movement. So he made many prophecies that his believers considered to be evidence of his prophethood, and have many other miracles attributed to him. Oh, I realize there's a typo here. Yeah, because there's also, Anandamayi Ma, a 20th century Indian saint credited with many miracles. I'm just showing you here. So this should actually be a new paragraph there. That's a different person to this one. Anyway, and I've got some passages from a book about her there. Raghavendra Swami, similar figure from the 17th century. Oh yeah, we have an interesting story from him, from a British officer who visited there in the 19th century, so 2 centuries after the guy actually lived, and he allegedly had a vision of the guru visiting him. So we have someone from a completely different religious tradition actually having a vision of this Indian figure. Super interesting, and he still has devotees to this day. Shirdi Sai Baba, a 19th century saint who performed many miracles, exorcisms, levitations, bilocations. We have lots of sources for him. Sathya Sai Baba, he's a more recent Indian guru. Again, many miracles attributed to him. We have lots of those you can find online. I'll skip a couple here. From the Chinese traditions, there's less of a miracle tradition in the Chinese religious tradition, at least as far as I've been able to find, not compared to, say, India or the Christian tradition. There are some interesting resources that I did find. So ancient compendia of miracles. There was even, like, back in the, I think, 4th century, there was like a miracle battle between the Taoists and the Buddhists in China, basically compiling compendia of miracles to support each faith tradition over the other. I don't think that that's sort of very active in that sort of theological approach is actively pursued very much in China at the moment. And the problem is many of these ancient documents have not been translated into English, and so there's not a lot of detail I can provide, but there's definitely work there, and some very interesting accounts. Then there's mass hysteria and psychogenic illnesses. So I mentioned a number of these, which I think are similar phenomena to miracle claims, although exactly how you categorize them is going to be debatable. So mass hysteria are examples or instances where large numbers of people start reporting very strange phenomena, often things that are sort of objectively demonstrably not real, but nevertheless they believe in them. And often they occur sort of fairly spontaneously or apparently spontaneously in a particular location. And it's almost like a disease because it seems to be contagious. So some examples: the Seattle windshield pitting epidemic. Widespread observations of previously unnoticed windshield holes, pits, and dings on cars. We have newspaper reports of this from the time. Angels of Mons. So this is one that people may have heard about. An apocryphal tale of angels seen at the trenches in World War I, very widely reported and believed, but with no apparent basis in any original report. The interesting one here is not actually that people saw angels, but it's that many people believed that people had seen angels or reported seeing angels in the trenches. But there just were no original accounts of this. Everyone just spread it around. I mean, it's basically like fake news. I mean, you can just look on Twitter and probably find a million examples of this. N-rays, just Google N-rays. That's a fascinating phenomenon in itself. And something you might not have ever thought possible, genital shrinking epidemic. Yes, this is a thing. A widespread belief among males that their genitals are shrinking due to some kind of disease. There have been numerous occasions of this reported throughout history. I think most recently it's happened in a number of African countries, but if you Google genital shrinking epidemic, you can find out more about this. Again, you wouldn't think that people can be convinced that their genitals are shrinking due to some unknown and unspecified disease, but like this happens. This is documented. There's many apparitions of the dead that are reported. I won't go through those here, but complicated bereavement cases, anthropological cases, quite a number of those that are very interesting. Spiritualist accounts and parapsychology accounts. So many of these date from the late 19th century and the late Victorian era, when there was a lot of interest in spiritualism. And there was the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, which compiled a lot of these very, very interesting accounts that they developed. And they had many of the same kind of evidentiary standards that apologists talk about these days, like multiple attestation and things like this. So I went through and extracted a number of interesting examples from that. I won't go through them all here. Alfred Russel Wallace was interesting this and actually give some examples here. So yeah, I think we'll leave it there because I need to get going. But if you're interested in looking at more of these, you can pick up my book from Amazon, either soft copy or you can get it as an ebook. So my sort of summarizing this together, my answer to Cameron is, how many miracles have I looked into? At least hundreds. 500 is my guess. In all of these investigations, I've never found anything that I think comes remotely close to convincing me of the existence of the supernatural or the paranormal. I think many of these miracle claims, there's not really enough evidence to assess much of anything about them. For those where we do have a bit more evidence, I think they can all relatively easily be explained. Let's be fair. Some of them are a bit more complex than others, but most of them can fairly easily be explained by appeal to known psychological and sociological forces, memory distortion being a major one, as well as suggestibility effects and belief contagion and many other phenomena that I discuss in my book. Some miracle claims, I don't think, as I said, we have enough information to fully understand what happened, though I think we can often make reasonable postulates and sort of provide plausible accounts, like the RHBS model that I develop in my book and present in the case of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, for example. We don't have enough evidence to say whether that's what happened, but I think it's a plausible reconstruction of events that is much more likely than the explanation God did it. God did it, of course, is a terrible explanation because God could do anything, and so we don't really have any constraints on what he would be likely to do or not to do. And therefore, I think the prior probability of him doing any particular miracle is exceptionally low. Remember that of all of the miracles that could occur, the vast majority do not. And so it seems the prior probability of any specific miracle occurring is infinitesimally small. Even if you believe that God exists, he doesn't do most miracles. So if you're going to say any given miracle, any given phenomena was caused by a divine miracle, it seems that the prior probability of that is exceptionally low, in which case I think that it's a lousy explanation. I mean, there's more to say about that. I've talked about that in previous episodes. So that's my answer to Cameron. The short answer, the TLDR, is I'm basically happy to agree. Yep, let's go with evidentialism. Yep, let's say that miracles can in principle be evidence for God. And yes, we should look into miracles. That's an important thing to do. Yes, I've looked into many miracles, estimate about 500 of them. I've never found any of them that convinced me remotely that God exists or anything supernatural exists, though I have learned many interesting things about human psychology and sociology throughout the process, which I didn't know before, and I think helps us to understand the human condition much better. So I do recommend this. I do think it's worth doing, and I'm sure that there's much more that I still have to learn. So I'd love to chat with Cameron about this. This is one of my favorite topics, so he's welcome to come on my channel. I'll go on his channel. We can have a moderator, any format you like, really. I doubt he'd take me up on this, but the door is genuinely open there. I would be interested in talking about this. So that's my answer to his question. Hopefully his questions rather. Hopefully people found this interesting. I'll just have a quick look at chat here, and then we'll head off. Nathan says he he had genital shrinking disease until he ate shark fin soup with the horn of a black rhino in it. I assume he means that those cured his genital shrinking disease, which is good to hear, though I don't recommend trying that yourself. Black rhino horns in particular, I think, are a bit hard to get these days. Saved moralist soul, so that's good. Good to hear. MF Hume, welcome. Always good to see Hume here when we're talking about miracles. What time zone are you in? Well, there are many time zones on this earth, and so it's not an objective fact that it's too early for this. I think you find that that's relative to the time zone you are in. I'll tell you, it's just after 7 p.m. here, and you can maybe work out what time zone I might be in. You could also just listen to my voice and make a guess as to where I'm from. So are miracles times when God's corrected his mistakes? Well, this is actually an interesting point because God caused the universe to begin, right? This is the idea. And so he set everything up. Why does he then need to kind of intervene in the process later on and sort of fix things so that they go the way that he originally didn't make them go? This is what the 18th century deists said, right? They said, look, yeah, of course, God created everything. There's a designer, but he's not going to then second guess himself and intervene back in his own creation. I mean, if he wanted to have made something happen a certain way, he would have done it right the first time, which honestly seems reasonable enough to me. Of course, you can just always say, but he likes to intervene. He likes to get his hands dirty, even if he could have done it, from the outset. But of course, this is the problem with all theistic explanations, that you can just literally say anything, and there's almost no constraints on what God could plausibly have done. So it's a terrible explanation. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone. Hope you found this interesting. Just a short stream this evening, but I thought it'd be a good one to respond to that wouldn't take too long, and a nice shameless plug for my book. I do actually think that there's some really valuable stuff in here, particularly the miracle thing. I'm very proud of the research that I did there. I don't think you can really find that much elsewhere that looks at this variety of cases and kind of synthesizes that together. I mean, obviously, I would say that, right? I wrote it, but again, I genuinely think that that's true, and I could defend that claim. So if that sort of thing is interesting to you, look into this. I think more Christians should look into this, and they would, if engaging honestly with that, at least it would temper their confidence that the evidence for the resurrection is just heads and shoulders above everything else. Even if, it doesn't, I'm not saying it's going to convince everyone to be an atheist or something, but I think that it does, looking at these comparative miracle and supernatural claims, at least should, I think, does reduce people's dogmatism about this very narrow way of looking at things and looking at the evidence of Christianity and stuff like that, and opens your horizons to the fact that actually lots of strange and funny things happen that can be accounted for through human psychology and sociology, and things aren't as simple as the apologists pretend to say they are. It's like, it's either from God or it's like it's all lies or something like that. Anyway, thanks very much, everyone. Take care. I'll see you soon.